Sociology, perspective, theory, and method. What are some reasons people get married, and what are some rules about who we should marry? This is an important thing to think about because we often think that all of our decisions are made 100% completely independently on our own. But that's not really true. We make many decisions in life, but we do so as members of society. What is society? It's family, it's your local community, your nation, the entire world. And our social worlds guide our actions and our life choices. So if you notice in this chart, some things that guide choices about people getting married is usually they're within a 5-year age range. They usually have similar levels of education, and they're often of the same race or ethnicity. So sociology is the systematic study of human society, and it's a distinctive view that's guided by a sociological perspective. By society, we mean people who interact in a defined territory and have a shared culture. So Berger describes this sociological perspective as seeing the general and the particular, and basically that we can see general patterns in the behaviors of particular people. Now we know that society treats different categories of people differently, and thinking sociologically means we have to realize how the general categories into which we fall shape our particular life experiences. So many think of marriage as the result of a personal decision and personal feelings, but there are patterns that guide who we choose for a spouse. Looking at life sociologically also means giving up the idea that human behavior is the result of what we decide to do. We have to think about how easily society impacts us, right? So we're only a few years out from the COVID pandemic, but that really altered our lives. And it's altered lives long term. It has increased anxiety amongst young people. We saw an increase in sexual assault, especially amongst young people, an increase in loneliness amongst young people. And other societal forces, things like age, race, class, gender, those operate together and they increase or decrease our opportunities. So thinking about how society plays a role in our everyday lives, does society affect decisions about childbearing? So women's birth rates are often affected by what's going on in the economy. The lives of poor women are centered in the home, and so the typical woman has more children. Whereas women in high-income countries have more access to higher education, better jobs, and contraception, so they have fewer children, and in many cases, no children at all. And we can see how childbearing is very different. So here in New Orleans, there's a 29-year-old woman, Cindy Rucker, and she's having her first child. Well, in Afghanistan, a woman who's 28 already has 4 children. Now, one thing that's interesting about sociology is thinking about this idea about how does society impact things that we think of as individual decisions. And so Durkheim really wanted to investigate this. And you'll see Durkheim's going to come up a bunch here. And if you're a criminal justice major, a criminologist, Durkheim comes up for us as well. And so Durkheim does a study of suicide, something that we think of as a very individual level decision. And he looks at public records. And he sees that certain groups of people, certain categories of people, were more likely to die by suicide. Men are more likely to die by suicide, Protestants, wealthy, and unmarried people. And the key to this pattern, what he saw these categories have in common, was a degree of social integration. So people that had strong social ties had lower suicide rates, whereas people who were more individualistic had higher rates. In male-dominated societies, men obviously have more freedom than women, but more freedom can actually contribute to isolation and higher suicide rates. Those people in society who are routinely excluded as outsiders are much more astute at sensing the power within society. So, for instance, Black folks are often more aware of the role that race plays, right? We've been hearing a lot, probably in the last 5 to 10 years, about white privilege. And a lot of white folks balk at that. It's often hard for people who benefit from their identity to see how they benefit from that. Periods of crisis also spark sociological thinking. So during the Great Depression, a third of workers were unemployed. It becomes easier to see that this isn't just an issue of somebody's too lazy and they won't find a job. We can more easily see how societal forces play a role. Now, there's lots of benefits to this sociological perspective. First of all, it helps us assess things we think of as quote-unquote common sense. Things we take for granted are not always true. It helps us see opportunities and constraints in our lives and empowers us to be active participants in our society, and it helps us to live in a diverse world. Sociology helps shape public policy and law. It's played a role in things like school desegregation, busing, divorce law, social welfare. Clinical sociologists help troubled clients. And one more thing in terms of seeing things sociologically, it's important to think about people who live on the margins or people who are marginalized, right? And the role that that plays, as well as the role that a social crisis might play that allows us to turn personal problems into public issues. Now, it's also important for us to have a global perspective. This is going to be us looking at the larger world and what's the place of our country, our culture in that larger world. And this is just a broader extension of the sociological perspective. So what's the U.S. position? We're a superpower, we're a high-income nation. And what does it mean to be a high-income nation? High-income nations have very productive economic systems. Most people have relatively high income. You might be looking at that being like, I do not have a high income. Relatively high compared to the rest of the world. They generate a lot of the world's goods and services and control most of its wealth. And individuals in these countries live well, not because we're smarter or better, but we were fortunate to be born or to move or to live and grow up here. Now, a middle-income country has a moderately productive economy. People's incomes are around the global average. They're likely to live in villages. They might walk, they might ride scooters, they might ride animals. They might only have a few years of schooling. And we would see some social inequality there. Now, in a low-income country, they have less productive economic systems. People are poor. Most people are poor. So a small number of people who are rich. There's a lot of unclean water, not enough food, not enough sanitation, and not a lot of opportunity to improve their lot in life. Why does it matter if we have a global perspective? Well, where we live really shapes our lives, right? So we are fortunate enough to have been born here in the U.S. or to come here and study in the U.S. or our family immigrated here to the U.S. and that has really shaped our lives. Societies throughout the world are increasingly connected, and many of the social problems that we face here in the U.S. are much more severe in other places. So thinking globally is a good way to learn about ourselves as well. So in the 18th and 19th century in Europe, we start to see people focusing on society. And this is a result of some really big changes that are happening. First of all, we're going to see industrial technology. So instead of people working at home, people are part of these anonymous large workforces. They work for strangers who own factories, and this separates people from their families for large portions of the day. That really weakens traditions that have guided small communities. Along with this industry means that jobs are located in the city and we start to see the growth of cities. Landowners start fencing off land. Tenant farmers start going into the city seeking work. The cities grow. The streets fill with strangers. What does that bring? Pollution, crime, homelessness, a whole variety of problems. And then there's a lot of political change during this time period, right? So 18th and 19th century, right? Late 18th century is the beginning of the United States as a nation. If you think about like how new the ideas of our nation were at the time, we know there's a lot of political change happening. We're seeing a focus on individual liberty and individual rights. So in 1838, Comte coins the term sociology, and it's really referencing this new way of thinking in terms of how does society operate. And Comte sees how society operates as having 3 stages. And so up until the end of the Middle Ages, we have the theological stage. This is a very religious view of the world. The world reflects God's will. Then we move into this metaphysical stage. This happens around the Renaissance. People start to see society as natural as opposed to supernatural. And so society doesn't really reflect how perfect God is, but rather that humans are selfish, and that means we fail sometimes. And then beginning with Copernicus and Newton, we enter the scientific stage. And Comte favors this concept called positivism. Positivism sounds like it's something fancy. If you've taken criminology, you might remember learning about the positivist school. Okay, that just means it's a way of understanding that's based in science. So prior to this time period, right, everything is about like God's will or just human free will. And scientific stage is asking us to try to study things scientifically. So what's a theory? A theory is a statement of how and why specific facts are related. And sociologists come up with theories just like other social scientists do. And they use those to test their theories. So they do research to test these theories. Usually that's guided by some sort of paradigm, some sort of overarching view. And in sociology, there's 3 major paradigms. In each chapter, we're going to talk about a new concept. And towards the end, they'll talk about how that concept ties into each of these paradigms. So you definitely want to make sure you know and understand these. The structural functional paradigm, that sounds like it's something fancy. It just means we're looking at society as a complex system. There's all these parts and they work together to promote stability. And so the structural functional paradigm is always looking at like what role, what function does some part of society serve. So if we were going to study the family, which we do have a chapter on, we would talk about what role and function does family serve. It's looking for structure in everyday life as well. So things like, why do we shake people's hands when we greet them? Why do we have religious rituals? What purpose do they serve? Now, Comte points out that during periods of rapid change, it's really important for us to have social integration. And the structural functional paradigm leads sociologists to identify those structures and investigate their functions. Now, Merton says any social structure probably has many functions. Now, there's going to be manifest functions, the obvious functions it's supposed to serve, right? So like, what's the function of marriage, right? But then also it's going to have latent functions. These are things that are not necessarily intended and not necessarily recognized. So let's think about marriage. What purpose does marriage serve? What purpose does college serve? Well, we go to college to get an education, right? To gain information and skills to be able to perform jobs and make more money. But marriage also, this is why I keep saying marriage, I'm getting ahead of myself. College also serves as a marriage broker. It brings together people of similar backgrounds and ages, and many people meet their future spouse in college. Now, the effects of social structures are not good for everybody. There is social dysfunction. Those are undesirable consequences for the operation of society. Now, thinking about this paradigm critically, it sees society as stable and order, and its main goal is to figure out like what makes society tick, but it really ignores things like race, gender, class, which generate conflict, tension, and inequality. But don't worry, we have a paradigm to cover that too. That's the social conflict paradigm. This sees society as an arena of inequality that generates conflict and change. It looks at how class, race, ethnicity, gender, and age are linked to unequal distribution of money, power, education, and social prestige. So how do some social patterns benefit some people while depriving others? And it really focuses on the fact that the people who are on top, the people who benefit the most, want to keep and sustain those privileges, and the disadvantaged want to gain more. So a thing to think about here is, what are some of the ways that the lives of the wealthy depend on the work of the people of lower social position? Now, some critical evaluations of this paradigm. It ignores the fact that there are shared values and there are things that make us interdependent and that can unify and stabilize society. It doesn't have a lot of scientific objectivity and tends to paint society in pretty broad strokes. Now, we've got a couple of paradigms or theories that fall under this paradigm. So one would be feminism and gender conflict, right? If we're talking about conflict, we'd also be talking about how gender plays a role in that. So this is focusing on inequality and conflict between men and women. Now, feminism is a word that's often seen as sort of a dirty word, or a lot of people don't want to be identified as feminists. But if you believe that men and women should have equality, then you are a feminist. That's what feminists believe. Feminists are not man-haters. That is not a goal of feminism. Okay, it's social equality. Now we've got a couple famous female sociologists here. Harriet Martineau is the first female sociologist, and she translates Comte's work from French to English. She documents slavery. She argues for laws to protect factory workers. She fights for changes in education for women. Jane Addams wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and she was a sociological pioneer. She dealt with issues involving immigration and the pursuit of peace. Now, just like gender plays a role, so does race, okay? And so race conflict theory is going to look at inequality and conflict based on race and ethnicity. Now, it's important to know that race and ethnicity are two different things, okay? Ethnicity has to do with culture and countries of origin, right? So if you tell people, oh, I'm Irish and Italian, that's ethnicity, okay? Race, there's 3 racial categories, according to sociologists. If you were to answer these questions on like a census or a survey, people might have more categories for that. So race is white, Asian, black, okay? The only thing that differentiates one race from another is like a handful of small physical traits. And in fact, you may have more in common with someone of a different race, genetically, biologically, than you do with someone of the same race. In the United States, when we measure things for government purposes, we measure race as one of 5 categories. So there's white, there's black, there's Asian/Hawaiian Pacific Islander, Native/Alaskan American, and what did I miss? I might have grouped 2 of those together. Often when we measure ethnicity in the United States, we measure it as Hispanic, not Hispanic. Now, depending on where you're from, right, you might see those as different things. So I think if we ask people who are from Puerto Rico, people who are from Colombia, what their race is, they would tell you they're Puerto Rican or Colombian, okay? That is not how we define race here in the United States. Race is a social construct, by the way, okay? It's not like a real thing based in biology or genetics, okay? Ida Wells Barnett was born to slave parents, but rose to become a teacher and a journalist and a newspaper publisher. And she was really a big campaigner for racial equality. Du Bois earns a PhD in sociology from Harvard. He founded the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory and believed that sociologists should not simply learn about society's problems, but also try to solve them. So he's one of the founders of the NAACP. Now, what are some criticisms of social conflict theory? This, as you know, gender, race, our social identities have been like a hot topic in the last 5 to 10 years. And so that's gained a lot of following in recent time. These theories tend to focus on inequality, but at the expense of the fact that we do have shared values. Now, our third paradigm is the symbolic interaction paradigm. And it's really telling us that the other 2 paradigms take a macro approach, and this is micro. It's sort of like on an individual level. It's looking at specific situations, and it sees society as the product of everyday interactions of individuals. So reality is socially constructed, and it almost doesn't matter what quote unquote truthfully or quote unquote objectively happened, right? My reality is how I perceive things. Reality is how we define our surroundings. A couple theories under this. One is dramaturgical analysis. It really is looking at things as though life as though it is a play. What are our various roles? And social exchange analysis says that our interactions are guided by what we stand to gain and lose from others. Now, criticisms of this paradigm. This view reminds us that society amounts to people interacting, but then, of course, it's overlooking big picture things like culture, race, gender, and class. So when we're doing research, we have some frameworks that are going to play a role here and things to think about. And one is gender. Research is affected by gender. Okay. So, and it can affect our research in a couple ways. So one is androcentricity. This is where we act like only the position of men's and actions of men are important or matter. A lot of research in sociology early on and criminology, probably in psychology too, although I can't speak authoritatively about that, is done by white middle/upper class men, and the research subjects are also men. We then often take that data and generalize it to everybody, even though it clearly wouldn't apply to women and probably doesn't apply to people of color. Gender blindness is failing to consider the role of gender at all. We want to make sure we're not using double standards, judging men and women differently. And then a final thing to think about is, depending on the type of research you're doing, you might have to think about how your respondents, your interview subjects, might react to your sex and your gender, and that could interfere with your project. Now, ideally, we want to be objective and neutral in our research. We can't be totally neutral. I mean, first of all, when we do research, we tend to pick things that we care about, right? So my areas of interest that I often do research in are my expertise is in sex crimes, and in particular statutory rape. And then I've also done some research on serial killings. I've done some research on other stuff that in the crim department we kind of refer to as crazy people doing crazy people behavior. As I mentioned, most sociologists, white, highly educated, politically liberal. That's going to affect the research. Now remember, positivist sociology is based on systematic observations, okay? This kind of assumes there's an objective reality out there, and our goal is to gather evidence to try to discover what that is. Now, interpretive sociology studies the meanings people attach to their social world, and it differs from that scientific perspective in a couple ways. So scientific sociology focuses on action, whereas interpretive focuses on the meaning we attach to behavior. Scientific sees that there's an objective reality out there, whereas interpretive sees reality as constructed by people, right? What does this sound like? Our symbolic interaction paradigm. And scientific tends to favor quantitative data, whereas interpretive really favors qualitative data. Critical sociology is going to correspond with what? The social conflict paradigm. This focuses on the need for social change. Should society exist the way it does? And Marx said the point of studying society is not just to study it, but to change the world. Now, sociologists rely on empirical evidence. Those are facts we can verify with our senses, things we can observe, and the key is to observe them systematically, okay? So it also challenges things that we think of as quote-unquote common sense, right? Do differences between men and women reflect human nature? No, a lot of that reflects how we're socialized, right? We tend to think of the U.S. as a middle-class society in which most people are roughly equal. Nope. Not so much true. People get married because they're in love. Yeah, but also people get married for a wide variety of reasons. So when we're doing research, we're going to have to start with some concepts. These are mental constructs that represent some part of the world in a simple form. And then in order to measure that, we're going to look at a variable. Okay, and that's a measure of a concept, and the value changes from person to person. Okay, so maybe I want to study gender. Okay, gender might be my variable, and it varies because some people are men, some people are women, some people are non-binary, right? How do people identify? Measurement is the procedure for determining those values. How do we measure someone's gender? Well, we often ask them, right? So for a long time, gender is just measured as male, female, right? And depending on the type of survey you're filling out, those might be the options you get. You might get lucky and have one that says like gender nonconforming. You might see non-binary. If the research is being done by someone with a sophisticated understanding of gender, you might see actual specific alternatives to male, female. Okay. But as a researcher, we have to define that. How are we going to define gender? How am I going to define happiness if I'm measuring that? Now, most of the time, we're going to look to the prior research and see, like, how have people been measuring this, right? And then we might be arguing that, like, the way we've measured gender before kind of sucks, and let's think about a new way to measure it. Now, when we're doing research, we need our measurements to be reliable and valid. Reliable means it's consistent in how it's being measured, that we're all measuring it the same way, okay? And validity means I'm measuring what I intend to measure. So maybe I've asked you a series of questions in the hopes that they're gonna sum up to a score that indicates happiness. In order for that to be valid, it has to actually be tapping into happiness. Maybe what I learned from my research is, wow, my measure kind of sucks, and it doesn't really tap into that. Okay. Some stuff is easier to measure, like age. We all have a specific age, right? We just like subtract your date of birth from today's date. That's your age. Now, quantitative sociologists are going to use a lot of numbers. Descriptive statistics describe a population or describe a sample. You guys are probably familiar with measures of central tendency. And by the way, if you're a sociology, a psychology, I think human services, and definitely a CJ major, you are required to take research methods. So you will learn this in much more depth, and you will also learn statistics in much more depth because you're required to take that too. Both of those are taught by me. So if you're taking them, we'll get into this more in the future. But you guys are probably familiar with mean, median, and mode. Those are ways of describing where your data tends to center. We're also looking at our variables, and we're trying to see if the variables are correlated, and then ideally we might like to show that there's a cause and effect happening. So correlation means two variables change together. It does not mean causation. It does not mean one thing causes a change in the other. We have to have a few things present in order to show causation. Okay, so our independent variable is our cause, our dependent variable is our effect. But it's possible that things are correlated and they have what's called a spurious relationship. Neither one of them are causing the change in the other. The change is caused by some third thing. Okay, so for instance, two things that are correlated are the sale of ice cream and drownings. When one of those goes up, the other goes up. And when one goes down, the other goes down. So pause for a minute and think of whether or not ice cream causes drownings, or drownings leads to ice cream sales. What do you think is causing both? Summer, right? Summer is probably related to both. So if we want to show cause and effect, we have to show first that those variables are correlated, they change together. The independent variable has to come first. A lot of times we can't show that in our data. We don't know when one thing happens versus the other. And we have to be able to show that it's not spurious. So it's not due to summer or some other third variable. It's really important to follow ethical guidelines when you're doing research with people, which doesn't mean experiments on people, literally surveys is research on people. You have to get IRB approval. An IRB is an institutional research board. It reviews research proposals to make sure that they are safe and not harmful to humans. And in order to do that, you submit a research plan, but you also have to submit that you have completed a human research subject training. Okay. You can do this for free. It's not super hard. And if you take research methods, you will do it. So things we want to make sure we're doing when we're researching. Well, first of all, we should be competent in the field that we're doing. So sometimes people research outside their area of expertise. And while they may understand the research procedure very well, if you don't understand the underlying variables, your conclusions will be garbage. Now, in my field, in criminology, this happens with the death penalty. Okay, so there's a bunch of research on the death penalty done by economists. Criminologists don't care for economists. Okay, economists are not trained in criminology, and so they look at some data, they throw in some variables, and they'll tell you every person executed saves X many lives. And some of this research is like every person you execute saves 8 lives, 10 lives. Well, that's a big impact. That sounds like the death penalty is just where it's at, and we should be executing everybody. However, that data is wrong, okay? And this is the problem with, well, I understand how to do a survey and I understand how to look at data and how to run that data and how to get results. If I don't understand the underlying concepts, I don't know what that data means, okay? And so it would be wrong for me to do economics research because I don't have the requisite expertise. So sometimes it's good to Google the authors of articles you're reading and see like, hey, does this person have any business talking about this? It's important to make sure that you disclose your findings without omitting significant data. Don't cherry pick your findings to make your argument look good. You want to make sure that you share your research with people who may want to conduct the same study. As I mentioned already, we have to make sure that our subjects are safe. And part of that is getting informed consent, right? So we have to make sure our subjects understand what's happening. They understand the risks and the benefits, and usually you're going to get their signature on a form that says they consent to this. If you're financially backed by somebody for your research, you need to make sure that's in your publication. So a lot of research on drugs and how well drugs work is paid for by the people who make the drugs, okay? So that's important to know because maybe that payment leads to a conflict of interest. So you got an idea, you want to test it, you got a hypothesis, a theory of a relationship between two variables. Maybe you're going to do an experiment, okay? You guys all remember experiments. You took lab science in high school, right? So we're going to specify our variables, we're going to measure them, we're going to expose the dependent variable to the independent variable, remeasure, and see if we have any changes. Now, while it is possible to do experiments in this field, it's not always wise. So there's a famous one called the Stanford Prison Experiment done by Philip Zimbardo. Zimbardo still kind of thinks this is an important study. And while it does tell us something about power and violence, it's also an unethical study, and you would not be able to do this study today. So basically, he recruits some people to play the roles of like prisoners and guards. And they use like the basement in an empty dorm for a weekend. And some people are assigned to be prisoners. Some people are assigned to be guards. And then he just kind of lets them loose. And very quickly, the guards kind of get drunk on power. And they're actually mean and cruel to the quote unquote prisoners. Now, remember, these are all college students who are just volunteering for this study. And Zimbardo is also like, he's not just an objective observer. He's kind of taking part in the study, which is a big no-no. And crap hits the fan and it becomes a problem. And basically, Zimbardo has to call it early. He has to stop the experiment early. And he doesn't even want to stop the experiment early. Basically, one of his colleagues is like, yo, you got to stop this. We can do other types of research. We can do surveys. I'm sure you've all answered a survey before. We ask people a series of statements or questions. Usually we take a sample of a population we want to know about, and if we have sampled it correctly, then we can draw conclusions about the larger group. You can also do field research. Okay, this is where we would systematically observe people. We might even join in their routine activities. There's a woman, Ginny Sykes. She wrote a book called 8-Ball Chicks. She followed and did some participant observation with 3 different all-girl gangs in 3 different parts of the country. She doesn't participate in like drive-bys and crime, but she participates in birthday parties and dinners and things like that. And probably one of the most popular types of research, certainly in criminal justice, and probably in sociology as well, is using data that already exists. The government collects a ton of data, guys. Crime data, data about how many people receive food stamps, race, who's born in another country. Right? This data is pretty much freely available for you. It's in big data sets. You have to learn how to use it, okay? But we can use this to analyze things. So for my dissertation, I looked at statutory rape and I wanted to see what kind of factors were driving arrest. And so I looked at police data, freely available off the internet, pain in the ass to put together. And then I paired it with some data from the census to see if there were characteristics of like cities and towns that played a role in whether or not somebody got arrested for statutory rape. So you want to do some research, some steps here. What's our topic? Okay, then we have to know what do people already know. Now that doesn't mean what have you already learned. It means you have to do a literature review. You have to dig into the research, right? So when I did my dissertation on statutory rape, I literally read everything that's published on statutory rape. Now, not all of it applies to what I'm doing. In fact, a lot of it did not apply because I wanted to look at something no one had looked at before. So what I also did was I looked at aggravated rape and what does the research on that say? And do I think the same things drive what's called clearance, which is arrest rates for statutory rape? So what exactly are your questions, right? What resources do you need to carry out your research? Are there any ethical concerns? What method will you use? How are you going to record your data? What do your data tell you? What are your conclusions? And how can you share what you've learned? So a lot of research gets shared in peer-reviewed journal articles, which you guys are probably familiar with, gets shared at conferences. So a lot of times people present at a conference and then their research gets published. Sometimes people just present at a conference. Now, one of the main benefits of learning and applying the language of politics, right, is that it can empower us to be more engaged. And sociology has less political theories and theories that are much more political. If you think about a big thing sociology is really looking at is like race, class, gender, right? And those things, while they should not be political, are pretty political, right? So does this mean then that we're just observing people and then we're going to like create generalizations about them? And if that's the case, is this nothing more than stereotyping? Well, generalizations don't apply to everybody. When we say this is common amongst women, we don't mean every single woman does this, right? There's like quite literally nothing that every single one of us does. Well, I guess we all breathe and die. That's what we all do. And eat, maybe that's it. A lot of times, right, part of what you're doing here is showing data that these generalizations are accurate, right? We want to offer them fair-mindedly. And so a sociology classroom is a good place to look at things that we think of as common stereotypes and figure out if they're true or not.